Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On June 22nd, 1979, the Professional Football Researchers Association was officially founded in Canton, Ohio. A little over a month later, in the same city, the 1979 Pro Football Hall of Fame enshrinement occurred, which was important to this week's guest beyond just the normal annual tradition. For you see, this week's guest really started getting into football, and subsequently then the PFRA later in life, because of one player. And that player is often referred to as Johnny U.
Welcome to the Football History Dude Podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
This time as you step off the DeLorean, the date is September 6th, 1964. We're at Fawcett Stadium in Canton, Ohio. Now we're here to witness a Hall of Fame game between the Baltimore Colts and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, the game itself was not that big of a deal because the Colts would put a whooping on the Steelers 48-17. But the score was not the important part of the game for this week's guest. For you see, this was the first game a little boy really remembered going to where he was able to watch and then become enamored by a quarterback later destined for Hall of Fame glory in 1979. Of course, this is Johnny Unitas. Now that's where the timeline kind of weaves again. That's because Johnny U is inducted on July 8th, 1979 to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, along with Dick Butkus, Yale Larry, and Ron Mix. Again, this week's guest, first love of a player, was Johnny U. But let's take that DeLorean back a little bit to June 22nd, 1979. A group would form to protect and preserve the history of professional football long after many of the primary accounts of the events had passed on. We'll liken it to the terracotta army of Ting Shi Huang, China's first emperor. You see, these statues were believed to have been buried with the emperor to protect him in the afterlife. And this week's guest may be like one of those generals of pro football's terracotta army, seeking to protect football history for centuries to come. With that, though, let me introduce this week's guest. His name is George Bozeka. Now, George is the Assistant Executive Director and Assistant Publications Director for the Pro Football Researchers Association. He also is on the Biography Committee, has helped with multiple football books on pro football history, and is one of the main event organizers for the Pro Football Researchers Convention. And beyond that, if you want to learn more about George and his experience about growing up at the doorsteps of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, well, after this interview, I suggest that you head straight over to the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, because you can listen to episode number 256, which just aired a couple days ago, to hear way more cool stories about George Bozeka living next to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I must say, you might get a little bit of jealous, so head a look and check up something called wisdomquotes.com to help guide us a little bit. There's many over there, but the first one that popped into me when I was kind of coming down and scrolling through the screen was a guy loosely related to the history of football. Teddy Roosevelt was quoted once as saying, "Comparison is the thief of joy." So again, just think about that before you listen to that interview that Darren had with George, because there's gonna be a lot of emotions for you. Boyhood wonderment, growing up next to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But speaking of emotions, Now's a good chance to let you in on another partnership that we have with a recent movie release. This movie is called Vanquish, and it is now available on digital and on demand. Ruby Rose and Morgan Freeman star in Vanquish, the intense action thriller that shows what desperation can drive a person to do. When a woman's daughter is held hostage by a retired cop, she is forced to do his bidding by taking out a series of violent gangsters in order to see her child again. Vanquish is available now everywhere you rent movies. Rated R from Lionsgate. And if you're interested in this movie, we got some digital copies to give away for you. This time, though, we're not going to go to the sportshistorynetwork.com/contest, which normally there's a contest going on over there. We're going to keep it to just the listeners of this podcast. If you are interested in a digital copy of Vanquish, email the Sports History Network contact email with the headline Vanquish, and I'll send a digital code to the first 5 emails. That's contact@sportshistorynetwork.com. And that's a way for me to give you that email address. If you ever want to get in touch with the Sports History Network, that's a good way to do it if you don't want to go through the website. Contact@sportshistorynetwork.com. But speaking of Vanquish, I think me talking solo needs a Vanquish from this podcast. You came here to learn more about our guest, George Bozeka. So yeah, I mean, because as I brought you on too, so like I said, we're going to talk about the convention, but one thing I wanted to discuss is it was announced the Pro Football Researchers Association membership topped over 400 members for the first time in 2020. A year that, quite frankly, in history classes are going to be talked about for probably 100 more years. The PFRA is dedicated to retelling stories of pro football from more than 100 years of a season. Why do you think organizations such as the Pro Football Researchers Association are so important?
I think that it's important because of the fact that I think history in and of itself is very important. And I think preserving that history, and not only preserving that history, preserving an accurate history, which is, part of what we do and what we attempt to do is to, research an accurate history of the game all the way back. And then, to disseminate and share that information. Because I think one thing I found in doing research is you could check a number of different sources and get a different take on something factually. And then you have to, through, various resources, decide, well, which is correct. Sometimes it's a firsthand thing. You talk to players, but oddly enough, I mean, sometimes even players remember it wrong. So I think that it's the importance of preserving that history and remembering where the game came from. I think sometimes that, a lot of people remember the game from the Super Bowl on and don't really know and realize, especially the young generation, that there's this huge history of the game even before the Super Bowl. So I think it's important to educate and, and then disseminate that. So I think that's why an organization like this is so important.
Yeah, I would agree. And you kind of hit it home with, so my generation, me personally, I did not know much about the history of the game before I started this podcast. I mean, sure, I heard of the name with guarantee and the stuff that they show all the time on NFL. And quite frankly, too, I can remember certain plays I made in my football days that I'm sure were a lot better in my head than what really were on paper and in the video. So things can easily be misconstrued. Now, when did you join the Pro Football Researchers Association yourself?
During the 2000s. I got really actively involved right after I retired. I was an attorney for 30 years with City of Akron, Ohio Law Department. And I retired in 2009. I'd been a member a little bit before then, but I became a really active member right after that. I was looking for, other things to do and to stay active, to keep the mind active. And I thought this was, a perfect thing in that regard. I had some other things that I was juggling too at the time. I've always have, 4 or 5 things up in the air, but this was something that was really a passion because of growing up in Canton. So that was the reason I got involved.
Well, yeah, I mean, growing up at the doorsteps of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I mean, that's something that football fans can only dream of. We'll say I've been there 3 times now in my life, but only 2 of them were within the past. It was the 2 years before COVID hit, but that was for the podcast. Before then, it was only 1 time. And of course, we had to go. I want to say before Barry retired, but they still had like a photo of him with the team, and then they had the AstroTurf. I just remember taking a photo with all of the Lions gear in the family. So definitely a unique situation compared to many fans across the nation who haven't even been able to be there. Have you always been a football fan, or is that something that came to you later in life?
No, always. I mean, I remember when I was Canton is in Stark County, and Stark County in Ohio is a hotbed for high school football. And we have Massillon, who I think everybody's heard of Massillon, and Canton McKinley, a huge football rivalry that's basically known nationwide. When they broadcast that game on the local radio station, they get a national audience through the stream. People as far as California listen to that game. In fact, I think it's I mentioned this many times. I mean, at one time there was a betting line in Vegas on that game. So I grew up in that atmosphere, starting around 62, 63. I was 7, 8 years old. I started attending high school football games, and high school football games in this area, it's not where you get the normal couple thousand people. You could have 10, 12,000 people on a Friday night here. So that sort of fostered that. Plus, living so close to Cleveland with the Browns, living myself within walking distance of the Hall of Fame, and my dad, all of my uncles, everybody in the family is huge football fans. We actually my uncle Steve, my dad's brother, was a spotter on Monday Night Football for a number of years. He spotted for Frank Gifford on Monday Night Football. So, and he also did local broadcasts of the high school games. So it's something in our family. My youngest son is a radio broadcaster at a station in Canton, and part of his duties are football, basketball, play-by-play. So it's just something that's through our family, and I basically grew up in that atmosphere and just have always loved football.
You mentioned that high school going to games 62, 63. Was the opening of the Hall of Fame in 63 like a huge deal in that neck of the woods, or was it backdoor? Okay.
No, it was. I mean, I remember, obviously I don't remember at the time because I was a little bit too young, but I've seen the headlines that were on the local Canton Repository newspaper. It was a big deal when Canton was chosen as a site. So it was. And, it's just grown so much over the years. It's just been amazing.
Yeah. Now you mentioned also your uncle was a spotter. I forgive me, I don't know what that term means. And
yeah, what that means is that when a play-by-play person is doing the broadcast, what my uncle did, and most play-by-play guys have a spotter. Basically, what they do is they create a spot sheet, and it basically has offense and defense and all the players in the positions. So basically, when Frank Gifford back in the day or anybody is calling a game, so that the call is seamless, usually they have somebody that's standing behind them. And what my uncle would do is he had sort of a pointer, and basically he would be there right behind Gifford. I've seen pictures, and he would prepare the spot sheets, and then he would be pointing so that if Gifford was saying, well, Unitas goes back to pass, it's a pass on the flat, and it's a completion to whoever the receiver is, that's where my uncle comes in. So, and he did it on Monday Night Football. How it happened is ABC used to come into Canton to do the Hall of Fame game, and sometimes they wouldn't bring their regular spotter. So since my uncle was involved too, pretty active in the Hall of Fame, he stepped in and did it. They liked him so much is that season, and I can't remember the year, but that season, just before the first game of the Monday Night Football schedule, they didn't have a spotter. So they remembered my uncle. They asked him, hey, you interested? And he wasn't. He did it for a number of years.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting because nowadays with technology, it's, they can press a button and
right.
Back then, totally different.
Yeah. So it was a great gig for him because, he would had his regular 9-to-5 job, and then he would travel on the weekends to wherever Monday Night Football was. And, he was with that sort of the legendary crew with Gifford and Cosell and Meredith, and then, the various iterations of that until he stepped down from that. But yeah, it was an enjoyable time for him. He actually even did some college games from time to time and some other things, but Monday Night Football was his big gig.
So through that, learning about different players and such, did that turn him into being interested in history of the game too?
As far as I know, yes, because I mean, my dad grew up in a family of 4 brothers, and they were all sports lovers, and they all, understood and respected the history of the game. But, I mean, anytime we all got together, everybody was talking football mostly, because that was the thing. Not to say that baseball and basketball isn't big, but in that area, that neck of the woods, Northeast Ohio, football's king. And everybody talks about football basically 365 days a year.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Texas for a while in the Dallas area, and those stadiums are just high school. They look like massive college stadiums. It's crazy, the difference.
Yeah, it is. My oldest son lives in Houston right now, and we've been down there to visit many times. And that's the thing I'm impressed by is I come in and I see all the high school stadiums. I said, well, hey, this is like home. So, because I mean, Texas is the same way, that same love. So it's amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, first thing I did when I was down there, I don't know if you can see my Lions hat right now.
I do.
But I had to go to Matt Stafford's old high school stadium and go get a photo with my jersey on it. This is like the first week that I was down there. And so you mentioned Browns was your team then growing up?
It was. From time to time, because I admired certain athletes. I there for a while. I mean, I was a big Johnny Unitas fan, so I followed the Colts for a while. I was a big Joe Namath fan. I think, that was just sort of natural growing up in the late 60s. And, it was a time I followed the Jets real religiously. And, even more recently, I really was a big fan of Kurt Warner and Larry Fitzgerald, and I followed the Cardinals too. But the constant throughout my whole life has been the Browns. And it's so nice for the Browns to actually be playing good football again, because it's been a wasteland here in Cleveland for many years.
Yeah, both of us have been dealing, with the same kind of situation. I mean, you brought up 2 dudes right there, Kurt Warner, Larry Fitzgerald. It's hard not to like those individuals. Of course, their performance on the field, but they're off the field type of guys too. And so did you ever get into fantasy football in the early days or at all?
I do various fantasy leagues with some friends of mine, and I did do football for a couple of years, but not real actively involved in it, but I did do it for a couple of years.
Yeah, because I find that nowadays, and I'm peeling back, getting away from leagues too, because like you said, how you found that you've watched other players. I found myself, I love the competitiveness of it, but it ruins the watching of the game for me, especially when my Lions are going against play. And then even DraftKings brings in even a whole new wrinkle, because every week you have a whole bunch of new people on your team. So yeah, that's something that I'm torn on, the love of the game, but at the same time, and this history thing, this is what really has kind of grasped onto me. And I really like it. Actually, as you and I are speaking right now, 2 days from now is the 3-year anniversary for this podcast to release. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
And the Pro Football Research Association, that's one reason why I wanted to bring you on here too, is a huge part of what at the very beginning. Now, most of my shows are interviews now, like we're doing today, but it was all solo episodes. I want to say I went to the PFRA website every day, multiple times a day for articles, and I could really trust and rely on your crew and your team to be able to make sure that it was accurate, and something that I know that you started and you're a founder, I don't want to say founder, chairman of, is the biography project. I wanted to get into that and describe what the project is and what the purpose of it is for the listener of the show.
Yeah, I'm actually a co-chairman. The 2 people that are basically doing the yeoman's work on this are Greg Tranter and Jeffrey Miller. They came up with the idea of doing a biography project, and basically to start writing biographies of NFL players, because they're both from the Buffalo area originally. Greg now I think lives in New England, but they're both originally from the Buffalo area. Jeff still lives in that area. They wanted to start with some of the Bills players from the 60s. So they've started with that, but it has really taken off. And I think it's an excellent tool for people, because I think eventually we hope to have biographies of most players that have played in the NFL and on back in as part of the project. It just, I think, it goes towards, preserving the history of the game. And when we're looking at all players, I think sometimes part of the problem is that people remember the Hall of Famers and those players. But, there's also, lesser players that are important to the history of the game. And sometimes their stories are even more interesting than than the famous players. I know when we have our conventions every year, we try to invite a couple of ex-NFL players. And, sometimes the players that we invite are just people that have had a cup of coffee in the league, but sometimes they have the greatest stories. So, I think it's good to preserve those stories as part of the history of the game. So that's basically been the purpose, because it falls in line with our mission. So that's been the main thrust with that whole project.
Yeah, that is going to lead us into talking about the convention. But before we get into this upcoming year's convention, you mentioned that you bring in ex-NFL players. Pick one story from one player that may have been obscure throughout your convention years and give me that quick story.
Oh God, I'm trying to think now. This is a tough one. He's really not an obscure player, but unless maybe you're a Cleveland Browns fan, I don't know if you would know the name Dick Shafrath. Dick Shafrath was an offensive lineman for the Browns in the 60s. He was on the line that blocked for Jimmy Brown. And there was a story that I asked him about when he was there that I heard that, he said it was a joy blocking for Jim Brown, but it was also difficult blocking for Jim Brown, because he said if he was pulling and he was in front, he said before he knew it, Jim Brown would basically be down his back, because that's how quick he was and how quick he was to get to the hole. And I just thought that, that just envisioning that whole idea, and Shafrath was really well respected. He's one of those players in this area that's just so well respected. I don't think he'll ever see the Hall of Fame. But he was of that line. Gene Hickerson was the great lineman of that line that actually made it to the Hall of Fame. But Dick Shafrath, and actually Dick Shafrath, it was an interesting story. He eventually became a state congressman with the Ohio Congress, not in Washington, but with the Ohio Congress in Columbus. But that's sort of a story that I remember is, the story about him telling about what it was like blocking for Jim Brown.
Yeah, someday I got to talk to a lineman that blocked for Barry Sanders, because I got to imagine like how hard that and difficult you're blocking someone else. Now they're going the other way, and now you're holding them and everything. So it would have been a totally different. And before we get into the PFRA convention and why I brought you on, I've heard this term yeoman's work twice in the past couple of days. What's that term without Googling it?
It means that the person that's actually doing all the dirty work and actually actually doing the nuts and bolts work of it. I feel like I'm a co-chairman, but Greg and Jeff are really doing all of the work. I was there basically to sort of help get the thing started, get it on our website, sort of give my 2 cents worth and everything else. I'm in the works, but as with a lot of our committees, the people that are actually doing the dirty work, as I should say, of putting everything together. That's what I mean by that term.
Oh yeah, I've heard that twice like I said, in the past couple of days. I think it was my day job. I saw someone else use that terminology. Yeah. So is it accessible for anybody who wants to try to create a biography with the guidelines that are put out there, or is it you have to apply or something like that?
It's basically been mostly our members right now, and they do have guidelines and everything and an invitation that's on the website if you click on the link, and then you can basically say, well, hey, I'd like to do a biography of this, and then basically Greg will say, yeah, go ahead with it, and then people submit the biographies. It goes through a little bit of a peer review and everything else, and there's guidelines that you have to follow, but that's
okay. Yeah, and speaking of members, let's get into the convention, because if you're a member, there's a certain fee. If there's a non-member, it's a certain fee. Let's talk about the PFRA convention this year, the big announcement. It's on. So what is it? Where will it be held? And what can guests expect out of this experience?
Yeah, the 2021 convention actually was supposed to be last year, postponed because of COVID. So it's being held in Canton, Ohio, at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the Gold Jacket Lounge. It's basically a 4-day weekend, 24th through the 27th of June. The convention itself actually occurs Friday evening and Saturday all day, which is normal. That's how our conventions always work. But over the last couple of years, we've had some add-on activities for people coming in early or leaving late. Thursday in the afternoon, we have an add-on in Massillon, which is about 7-8 miles to the west of Canton. they've just opened recently here in the last few years a Paul Brown Museum as part of the Massillon Museum, which is a general museum in downtown Massillon. So we're going to go over there and do a tour of the Paul Brown Museum. And then we're going to go from there to Paul Brown Tiger Stadium, which is a high school stadium named after Paul Brown, because that's where he coached when he was a high school coach. And they have a Paul Brown statue and a Paul Brown Ohio historical marker there. So we're going to go over and see that also. Friday, we're having a luncheon at noon at Bender's Tavern in downtown Canton, which has some ties to the NFL. Apparently, it was one of Jim Thorpe's favorite watering holes, and it's been one of the oldest restaurants in Canton. So we're going to have a luncheon there at 12 o'clock. And then after that, downtown Canton recently did a couple of things. They have a set of artistic pieces throughout the downtown area called the 11, which are 11 key moments in NFL history. Some of them are just abstract art. Some of them are murals. There's things that where the founding of the NFL was, that very spot where the Hupmobile showroom was. It isn't anymore, but there's always been a plaque there on the building, but they've now put a basically sort of an abstract sculpture there. Also, right across the street there is where City Hall they have a mural there. They have an art piece for the first draft. They have an art piece for the reintegration of the NFL with Kenny Washington, Woody Strode, Marion Molly, Bill Willis. They have one for the birth of the AFL, one for Monday Night Football. They're going to have one for Super Bowl III and for the 1958 championship game. But they have these. They have one for Red Grange, his start in the league. So they have these throughout the downtown area, and it's really fun to see them. There's some great photo ops and stuff like that, and these are throughout the downtown hub in Canton. And then that evening we have our convention. We're having speakers on both the pre-NFL history and then the founding of the league and the original teams. And then the next day on Saturday, we always open Saturday with a business meeting first thing in the morning. And then we are having two speakers in the morning. One I know for sure is John Maxima, who just wrote the book Pioneer Coaches of the NFL. And he's going to talk about Guy Chamberlain, who coached the Canton Bulldogs back in the day. And I'm working on my second morning speaker. I've got a feeler out. I'm just waiting for a confirmation. But I'm real excited about my afternoon panel. I was able to get, just within the last couple of days, 3 former NFL players that live here in the area or close to the area to commit. And there are Mark Miller, who was a backup quarterback with the Cleveland Browns during the cardiac kid years, the late 70s. Roger Duffy, who played with the Jets and the Steelers during the 90s and into the early 2000s. And Bob Vogel, who played with the Colts from about 1963 to 1972, played in both Super Bowl III and V. And he's a 5-time Pro Bowler, offensive lineman. Roger Duffy's also an offensive lineman. So they've all agreed to come in and be part of our NFL player panel in the afternoon. So we usually have them talk about some of their war stories, their careers, and it should be an exciting afternoon. We do question and answer period. And then we're also getting a tour of the Hall of Fame at the end. And we started something, I don't always mention this, but we started something at the last convention called the Quiz Bowl. And it's something we do at the end of the day on Saturday. So we're having Quiz Bowl 2. Just like Super Bowl 1, 2, and 3, we're having Quiz Bowl 2 at the end of the day. And basically, we have a member that's a math and science teacher down in New Orleans area. And he actually came up with the idea because he uses sometimes sports as a teaching tool. And he said, hey, I can come in and do sort of a Jeopardy type of Quiz Bowl. So what we did was we had everybody take an answer sheet, and then they fill it out on Friday. And then the top 3 make it to the Quiz Bowl. And then he comes in with the equipment so they can buzz in, and we put everything up on the screen. We project it up on the screen. It's just like Jeopardy. It was a lot of fun and really well received. So we're going to do that again this year too.
Yeah, that sounds like a fun-filled, packed, kind of historic moment type weekend for you. Yeah, and I almost forgot. We do have a Sunday add-on too. We're getting a tour of the Hall of Fame archives, behind the scenes tour. And that's done by John Kendall, who is the archivist at the Hall of Fame. And we've done that before when we were in Cleveland, and that was really well received. He brought out some things that don't make it into the collection that you see at the Hall of Fame because they have so much stuff.
But he brought in some things and showed us some things that were really, fascinating. We actually had us go back into the archives where they have most of the documentary archives. And the thing that excited me the most was he had some of the plays that Vince Lombardi had actually written. And that was really neat. I was blown away by that.
Yeah, I bet there's so many artifacts back there.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. But yeah, so that we're going to do that too. Plus, anybody that's part of it gets a meal Friday night, a meal Saturday, free parking at the hall, and all those things, and admission obviously for the tours. That's all included in the price, and it's $50 for members and member spouses, $100 for non-members. And since our membership is only $35, if you're not a member, you can save money by becoming a member. So, at any rate, so that's a good thing. It's a perk.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that to me, it sounds like the price is negligible when you factor everything in there. It's definitely worth it when it counts down.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's if you're a football lover and love the history, it's a great weekend for anybody in that loves football.
So you mentioned 11 moments that Canton has, like the murals and all that stuff throughout town. This is now my chance to bring this thing up to the forefront. We're going to ask you the first DeLorean question. And, you kind of got a little bit of that Doc Emmett Brown hairdo going on right there too. So maybe you got a little bit of his genes in you. I'm going to ask you the first one, which I don't know if this is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or Bogus Adventure. I can't remember which one's which, but do you remember the one where they brought all the historical characters? Okay. So that movie. So you can take my DeLorean. It's going to have 5 seats, one for you and 4 people. You can bring 4 characters from all of NFL history to now present.
Okay.
Which 4 characters would you bring?
This is a tough one. This is really a tough one. Let
me preface this too before that. I'm going to restate it because I got to add this to it. You can bring them all to this year and you can take them to the convention so everybody at the convention can talk to them. Great Scott! Before we fill up Mr. Fusion for George, now is a perfect time to share a cool partnership that we have. Something that maybe George will end up finding himself in a headline or two when he's out there picking up these 4 guys.
Hi, I'm Oz Davis of the True the Goats podcast here at the Sports History Network. I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
Okay. I'm going to name 2 coaches, first of all. Paul Brown and Vince Lombardi. And then if I were to name 2 players, and that's probably the hard one because of narrowing down all these players, but I'd have to say, and this is my own personal too, somewhat, I'd have to say Johnny Unitas and Jim Brown.
Okay, so you can bring those 4 and you can pick one of them. Or if you want all 4 of them, that's fine. Ask them one question as almost like reporter style. What would it be?
I would want to ask Johnny Unitas what it was like to be basically sort of, disrespected in the early part of his career, and then to basically rise to the heights of where he eventually came. Because I think everybody sort of knows that story, but what did that mean to him, personally, to go from that to where he ended up, playing for a semi-pro team? Not being respected as somebody that could play in the NFL, and then all of a sudden playing in perhaps what's considered the most significant game in the history of the game. So I think I would want to ask Unitas what his personal feelings are about that.
Yeah, and how much of that early stage of his career was like the fueling drive. I mean, he had to drive no matter what, but how much percentage did that take him over the edge? Like a Tom Brady situation nowadays, same kind of deal there. So you can pick 3 things from the modern current NFL to show these gentlemen from days old the differences and changes in the NFL. What would it be?
Well, I think for somebody like Unitas, I'd want to show him the changes in the protection of the quarterback. Because it's amazing to me. A couple of years ago, Joe Buck was doing a talk show. I forget where he was doing it, and it was on. I caught it on TV on one of the many stations I have on cable, and he had on Joe Namath, and then he also had on, I believe it was, I want to say Manning and another modern day quarterback, and I'm drawing a blank right now. And they were talking about, what football is like. And the one thing that Namath said was he would love to play in the modern NFL because, he was getting the crap beat out of him. Guys like Ben Davidson and the Raiders and everything else, playing part of a game with a broken jaw because, he was manhandled and thrown to the ground. And, he said that, I would love to play in the modern NFL where I had all that protection and you can't touch the quarterback and you can sit back there. So I think that's something that I think Unitas would probably appreciate because, he played in that era too, when, quarterback was a sitting duck, and, taking all kinds of that. I think with Paul Brown, what we were talking about just earlier is the technology of the game, because, he was known as an innovator. He was one of the first ones to try a microphone in the quarterback's helmet. And I remember reading stories that I believe it was either George Ratterman or one of the quarterbacks that he had. And so he could hear what Paul Brown was trying to tell him on the sidelines. He sometimes had to have to step away from the huddle and turn his head around in circles so he could get the signal. And now this is like, it's an accepted thing that the coach can talk to the quarterback. So I think Paul Brown, being the innovator that he was, I think that, he would probably, appreciate that. And I think with Lombardi, I think the fact that he was there for the first couple of Super Bowls and then died so young from cancer, I think maybe he would enjoy seeing what the Super Bowl has become. Because if you remember, the first Super Bowl wasn't a sellout. It was not a sellout. And it was something that grew, and now it's this huge extravaganza. I don't know how Lombardi would feel about that because he was such a, sort of a basics kind of guy, but I think he would be interested to see what the game has become.
Yeah, it's a funny, interesting type of, I don't know, Captain America going into ice and coming back out 50, 60 years, whatever it is after that type of deal. So speaking of that, now you get to take this DeLorean in the other direction. You yourself are going 100 years into the future. What does the Professional Football Researchers Association look like at this time?
I hope we're still an active concern. I hope that we still have an NFL. I sort of think that NFL by 100 years from now is going to be a much more global concern. I think we're going to see a day. One thing that was always interesting to me was a number of years ago when baseball celebrated their 100 years in 1969. I was 13, 14 years old there, and my dad would always pick up the Sporting News for me when the Sporting News was actually still a written newspaper that you could hold in your hand. I think I don't even know if there is a written Sporting News anymore. I haven't seen a Sporting News in years. I think it's all online. I may be wrong about that. I'm showing my age right now. But they had an article in there, but what was baseball going to be like in 100 years? And they referred to the fact that, because the Dodgers had moved from Brooklyn and then moved to Los Angeles, that the Dodgers are going to be the first team on the moon, and they were going to be called the Luna City Dodgers. And that there were going to be teams in Russia and teams all over the world. And it was going to be truly a World Series plus an interplanetary series. So, and I remember seeing too about what NFL, I remember during that same vintage seeing in magazines what the NFL was going to look like, say, as we got into the future. And it's amazing to me when they showed like the stadiums and stuff with the huge screens and all that, which were not existent back in the 60s and early 70s. That's all come to pass now. So I think that what we're going to see is a much more global game with teams, I think, that will be in Europe and teams that will be all over the world. I do believe that. I think that's what the NFL wants to happen. And I think the stadiums are going to be even more state of the art. And I think it's just going to be, amazing to what maybe people are going to see 100 years from now.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know when the technology is going to get there, but
right. Yeah. They showed the players being much more beefed up, which obviously has come to pass, and much more protection and everything else. I do think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, at some point in time, of course, there's the when does technology get in the way? It's no longer the same game. And that's always going to happen and going to transpire multiple sides of the fence. And back in the day, you had horse and buggy, then you had the train, then the car, the plane. Yep. So that just slowly, our planet, and then, like you said, interplanetary system will be at some point in time, in my mind, also connected, where they're traveling no longer from city to city, but it's planet to planet or solar system. It's crazy to think.
Yeah. And I think whereas there's still like travel concerns now about, say, playing games in London and the travel time and everything else, I think that'll be diminished too, because I just think that, it'll be another step of technology. So, I envision that. I mean, that's what I would expect just based on the way the game has progressed. So I think it's going to be interesting to, my grandchildren's children maybe will see that.
Yeah. I think it'll also be interesting to see how sports and other live events keep up with the technology advancing to the point where you can sit on your couch and it feels just as real as being there.
Yep.
And when that'll maybe flip a switch and that kind of thing.
I think you're right. I think that's going to be a thing too, I think it's going to be much more, realistic and stuff. I know that I haven't watched it at all, but I know they had this league, I guess, this year where you could actually help call the plays. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how that would work in the NFL, but I couldn't see Belichick doing that. But it'd just be interesting. How much more fan interactive is the game going to become?
Yeah. I mean, at some point in time, that may need to be what happens to keep them afloat. Who knows? I'm not here to predict the future, but we can fly into the future with the DeLorean and figure it out.
Yeah, it's always fun. Yep.
So I got something you mentioned to Jeopardy, that style that you have, the Quiz Bowl. I'm going to try something. It's like a new game, we'll call it, on this show. I've never really done before, like a rapid round or Blitz Creek, if you want. I want one interesting knowledge nugget about each one of the books that you've been involved in, the three main books.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a book. You give me an interesting knowledge nugget.
Okay.
1958 Baltimore Colts.
The interesting thing that I found that I didn't realize was Eubanks' pregame speech. He basically played off the fact that everybody on that team had been disrespected in some way and basically an outcast, including himself. And he used that as sort of a motivation tool before the game. He went around the whole locker room, and I actually saw the notes that are in his file at the Hall of Fame, and he pointed out every player and said, he talked to Unitas and he said, nobody wanted you, 75-cent phone call got you here, and he talked about Amici and this person and that person. And, and then he said, here we are in New York, and they were playing the Giants, who had just 2 years earlier been champions. They're playing in Yankee Stadium. And they said, here's your chance for redemption. And he played up on that. And it was interesting because one of the Giants players afterwards said that he felt that the Colts gutted the game out. And maybe that's what it took, because I think the Colts were considered at least to be much more of a blue collar type of team that was tied to the city and everything else, where, New York was more the glamour team, with Gifford and, all these guys, were at the big, New York watering holes back then, Toots Shores and PJ Clark's and all the nightclubs and everything. It was much more of a glitzy atmosphere. Although I think deep down, those Giants players were just every much as a blue collar, but that was the image is that they were the glitzy team because they were in the Big Apple. So that would be my thing was Eubanks' pregame speech.
All right, I got to stick to my theme because I have so many I'd like to have follow-up questions, but we're going to keep rapid quiz going.
Sure.
1966 Green Bay Packers.
Lombardi ethic. The thing that was so amazing to me about that team was the success that those guys had after football. So many of them went in and become successful businessmen or were successful in sports. And I think it was all because of Lombardi. And I know that's something that everybody hears, but I was really amazed at just the success of that team and how impressive that whole team was. The things they learned on the field with Lombardi, they took into real life, and they were just every bit as successful in real life with it. And that's the thing that impressed me so much about that team.
So now the next one will be kind of a teaser bomb for maybe a forthcoming project. 1951 Los Angeles Rams.
Yeah. The thing is, and this is sort of a maybe sort of a comical tidbit that has less to do with football and more to do with pop culture, but Crazy Legs Hirsch, and I will say this, he had maybe one of the great all-time seasons for any receiver that year. In 12 games, he had 1,495 yards. He had 17 touchdowns and 124.6 yards per game. I wrote that down because I wanted to make sure I got it right. I mean, he just had maybe one of the great, 5 seasons of all time by a receiver. But as did so many of the Rams on that team, being in Los Angeles, a lot of them got involved in the film industry. Bob Waterfield, one of their 2 famous quarterbacks, was married to Jane Russell, who was, a huge sex symbol at that time. But Elroy Hirsch was in a movie called 0 Hour! That's the movie that was the basis for the movie of a few years ago, Airplane, the comedy with Leslie Nielsen. I don't know if you're familiar with Airplane.
I think it's more than a few years ago.
Yeah, a few years ago. All right. Well, that shows my age, okay? My kids joke me about all that time. I said, it was about 5 years ago. Dad, it wasn't 5 years ago. But anyhow, that movie was a movie because he played a pilot in the movie who basically eats a piece of tainted fish. And because of that, he can't fly the plane. Now, I don't think it was meant to be a comedy, but then that became the comedy with Leslie Nielsen and Lloyd Bridges, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So he was in the original movie that was the basis for the movie Airplane, which I thought was really interesting. Has nothing to do with his football career, but I just thought that was unique.
Well, like you said, though, because of being in Los Angeles, that was 4 or 5, something like that, years after they had moved out there?
Yes, it was. They moved out. Actually, as the Cleveland Rams, they won the NFL championship in 45, and then they moved to Los Angeles because Dan Reeves, who was their owner at the time, looked at Los Angeles as being the promised land. And he said that we need to get an NFL team in Los Angeles. And even though there had been a couple of teams with Los Angeles in their name, the Los Angeles Buccaneers in the NFL in the 20s, and the Los Angeles Wildcats and Red Grange is American Football League, both those teams had the name, but they didn't play out there. They just had the name.
Well, going back to technology, I mean, the 50s, that's when you could really commercial airlines compared to back in the day.
Yep. So, and he saw that as a promised land. He had been out there. He had been impressed. And it was always his dream when he took ownership of the Rams to eventually move them out there. That was something that he felt needed to be done to get a team out there. And actually, once he opened that door, then you had the Dodgers go out there, you had the Giants go out there, and then, it started a flood out to the West Coast. So, and he was the first. He was a real visionary, a real pioneer in that regard.
Huh. And I had the author for the book that described when they went over there. I'm trying to remember how long ago this was. And I just thought it was so crazy after a championship and then like a couple nights or something like that after they're already packing up and leaving. Just insane.
Yeah, it was. It was almost immediate. Yeah, it really was.
All right. I got this right here. Again, we have the one last DeLorean question, right? You're going to go ahead. I hope we have enough juice left and you can get back enough in that Mr. Fusion because you have to drop off your 4 individuals back at their respective locations and give them the Man in Black little pen light so they can't remember that you brought them here.
I hope Doc Brown helps.
Yeah, great Scott. Right. Yeah. Hopefully Einstein, man, he's still waking up. He's still there. When you go back though, so you drop these guys off, right? And then you get to take my DeLorean for one last ride. You get to go to any point in NFL history and be present for it and kind of interact with some of the people. Where are you going to?
Without question, 58 championship game. Because it was, I know it's called the greatest game ever played. It may not be the greatest, but it's the most significant game because it brought football into what I think the modern era with television. It tied the game to that. And just when you look at the people that were in that game. Oh my gosh, I already mentioned Weeb Ewbank and obviously Johnny Unitas, Ray Berry, all the Hall of Famers. I think I saw a list one time, and I may be wrong, but I think if you include players and administrators and coaches, I think 17 people that were involved in that game are in the Hall of Fame, and that includes administrators, coaches, and everything else. I mean, that's quite a number, but it just. I would love to have been in Yankee Stadium for that game and just to see it and hear it because of the importance of the game, and seeing Unitas and on the Giants side, you obviously had Charlie Connerly, you had Frank Gifford, Kyle Rote, Sam Huff. Their head coach was Jim Lee Howe. I think a lot of people maybe know, maybe some don't. Jim Lee Howe had two great assistants. His offensive coordinator was Vince Lombardi, and his defensive coordinator was Tom Landry. So that game was seminal in many, many ways because, I mean, basically Lombardi went on and Landry to basically, as coaches, sort of dominate the 60s and part of the 70s, so, and then it all sort of started with that game. So I think if there's a moment, and that's a hard one because, I could also say Super Bowl III, I could say the Ice Bowl, but I think after everything is said and done, I think it would be the 58 championship game. I would love to go back and be in the crowd.
I want somebody that's listening right now, go back to all my episodes and tabulate it because there's three main point. It's that moment. It's the, like you said, Super Bowl III, and the other one is the founding of the NFL that get brought up the most. Yeah. And okay, we're going to bring up a brand new, just boom.
Yeah.
Another series, a quantum leap style. You go to the 58 championship. Who are you transforming into? Which player or coach?
Oh, I think I'd want to be Unitas. Yeah. Yeah. He was the first player I really idolized. I remember when I was a kid, at a certain point, I got to see him play, even though I don't really remember it because I was only 8 years old, but he played in the Hall of Fame game in 1964, the Colts and the Steelers. And I had to actually go back and see, he threw like 2 touchdown passes and threw over 200 yards. But I just remember being at Fawcett Stadium. That was obviously the stadium next to the Hall of Fame at that time. And I remember going with my dad and my uncle and seeing that. And I think that would just sort of spurred me, but I remember asking for my birthday the one year for a blue jersey and a helmet. And they didn't have the NFL stuff back then, and maybe they did. Maybe it's just that my parents couldn't afford it being blue collar, but I remember I wrote the logo on the helmet and stuff because I wanted to be Johnny Unitas. So I would say it would have to be Unitas.
Yeah, that's similar to me. My style, I'd like to be Barry Sanders. I was going to be Barry Sanders till, I grew up and I wasn't. So the 60s, 70s preseason games, did they play for real, legit, actually played?
Yeah,
or okay,
they did. I had to look back. That game was played like the first weekend in September. But one of the things I noticed from researching like the Colts and the Rams books, and not so much that I did, but the person that wrote the chapters on that, Mark Ford, who is our executive director, it really amazed me that how much the starters actually played in the exhibition season. I mean, they played in those games. So, it's not like today when you maybe see them for a couple plays or maybe a couple series of downs. They actually played through those games. So I think that was really one of the big differences back then is that, you normally, if you went to a Hall of Fame game, you were bound to see the starters for at least a half, so, I mean, it wasn't unusual, and sometimes into the third quarter. Now I remember going to more recent Hall of Fame games, and you'd be lucky if you seen them for a series, if at all,
Right, right.
And that's true with exhibition games. A couple of years ago, my son was in town from Houston, and I was able to get us tickets for a Saints-Browns preseason game. And we went hoping we'd see Drew Brees. Well, we saw Drew Brees standing on the sideline, but he never got into the game. So, it's sort of disappointing. Well, we say, we saw Drew Brees, but we never got to see him throw a pass. So,
yeah. Carl Mecklenburg because I asked him a question about how he played in the 80s. So I said, hey, did you guys actually play because of the Pro Bowl? Did you actually play? He's like, yeah, man, it was like live bullets. We were playing for real. We were playing to win.
Yeah. It was really a different time. I remember seeing pictures of Namath playing in the Pro Bowl back in the day, and he's on the sidelines, sweaty with they must have been playing in a lot of heat because he had like an ice pack on his head and he looked dirty and everything else, and so, yeah, I mean, those guys are really playing in those games back then.
Yeah, I mean, going back to our point earlier, before we get into the last send-off, the transformation of how the game has changed so much, to what point it's really interesting to think, what is it going to be like even in 20 years, because how much has changed over the past, say, 30 years as far as those things off the field type of things that don't even relate directly to the game. So last words, convention, PFRA, whatever you want to discuss, you have the open floor. Go.
I hope that people check us out on our website. It's profootballresearchers.org. If you're not a member and you're a football history buff, which I assume you are if you're listening to these podcasts, I encourage you to go on our website and get a membership. It's the best $35 you'll spend in a year. You get 6 issues of our magazine, The Coffin Corner, which comes out every other month, which has great articles about pro football history on things that that sometimes people haven't, thought of. We try to do unique things in there or just rethink things that have already, happened in the history of the game. So I think if anything, I would just encourage people that aren't members to please check us out. I don't think you'll be sorry. We have a great members only section. We also have a great, forum where people come on, and even guests can come on to the forum. But sometimes you can find a lot of history just on our forum from people that are, posting on there. It sometimes amazes me the depth of information and knowledge of some of our members on the forum. So and the thing is that if you say something that's not right, somebody will probably correct you, but that's a good thing, because as I said, we're about accurate history of the game. That's what we're all about. So, and that's what we strive for. So I would say that to please check us out.
There you go. Straight from the guy that grew up at the doorsteps of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Again, to learn more about George and the PFRA convention, I highly recommend that now that you're done listening to this episode, you head over to episode number 256 of the Pigskin Dispatch with your host, Darren Hayes. And if you want to jump in on a free 7-day trial at newspapers.com, like we said in the middle of this episode, you can do so by heading over to sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. But for now, dude, I am through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
The 2021 Professional Football Researchers Association Convention will be held at the Gold Jacket Lounge at the Pro Football Hall of Fame during the final weekend of June. Convention speakers will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the NFL. The fee for the convention is $50 for members and $100 for non-members. The fee includes admission to the convention and Pro Football Hall of Fame, meals on Friday evening and Saturday afternoon, and free parking. All convention activities are subject to COVID-19 protocols. For more details, click on the 2021 PFRA convention link at profootballresearchers.org.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.